Hi everyone, welcome to the Yissilmissil Productions channel. My name is Steven Yissil. Today we're here to talk about the Chicago film industry and read from the book Flickering Empire, or How Chicago Invented the U.S. Film Industry. And this is by Michael Glover Smith and Adam Selzer. Now, so far we've just gotten introductions to the key players of the Chicago film industry on the previous chapter we read. And today, chapter 2 is titled The Columbian Exposition. Now, I personally have taken college courses on Chicago history, and one of the units we covered was the Columbian Exposition. I had to read The Devil in the White City, which was a novelization of the World's Fair being planned by the architects to build, as well as going into the murder spree of H.H. Holmes that occurred roughly around the same time. So what I'm going to do for today is go through the entirety of chapter 2 here, which isn't too much. It's 8 pages. There's a few pictures, but I think it'll be a good show. Hey Jason, good to see you there. Alright, so yeah, we got a few of you already watching, and again, for reference, we will be reading from Flickering Empire by Michael Glover Smith and Adam Selzer. And if I recall anything as we move along here from what I absorbed the last time I went into this topic, I'll bring it up. But I think right now we are saving that to be like peppered in throughout as we read. And then once we're done with the book, we'll go into a little more detail on my opinions of everything. But I do have a plan here to incorporate a few other books into this. I guess my plan is to do a few, like a chapter from one book and a chapter from another book on the same show. I don't know. I'm still throwing that idea around, but for today, we're going to stick with chapter 2, and that'll get us 2/3 of the way through part 1 of this book. But I think this is going to be pretty interesting for today. So, without further ado, chapter 2, The Columbian Exposition. Even as the Exposition Universelle was underway in Paris Americans were making plans to stage a similar extravaganza in the United States. America was still a new country in those days. The Constitution was barely a century old. For much of its history, America had been seen as a weird, experimental little nation. Although some progressives overseas spoke of it as a veritable wonderland that had corrected the problems of the old world, far more people saw it as a nation of disgusting slobs and of people with no sense of their place in the world. That the cries of freedom were coming from a land whose economy had once been, and to an extent still was, based on slavery, and was an irony that escaped hardly anyone. Charles Dickens had imagined America as a promised land, but when he sailed, there was a young man. He found him dirty, grimy, land full of shysters, hucksters, savages, thieves, con artists, and people who lived in poverty and misery, a country in which the national pastime seemed to be spitting. That's spitting. The experience shook him so badly that some commentators feel that he never really recovered his former optimism. That's Charles Dickens. As the Civil War raged, the popular perception of America began to shift from that of a potentially promising experiment to that of an experiment that had failed. Other people felt differently. As the wilderness was tamed and the age of invention brought untold progress, some commentators thought that this vast land could emerge as one of the most powerful nations in the world. Chicago's 1893 Columbian Exposition would be the way that America introduced the 20th century and itself to the world. Chicago was barely a generation old, but no city had ever grown so fast or so high in such a short span of time. Tens of thousands of years of human civilization had been, in the past, required to produce a single city with a population of more than 1 million people, but by 1890 Chicago had gone from a few thousand inhabitants to more than 1 million in fewer than 50 years. Even the devastating fire of 1871 had failed to halt the progress. Indeed, after the city had burned to the ground, many Chicagoans seemed determined to roll up their sleeves and make their city better than ever. Skyscrapers throughout the city were soon stretching more than 200 or 300 feet toward the sky, not so high as the Eiffel Tower, but a sight to behold. Chicago's reputation around the country was still mainly that of a city of crime, corruption, and prostitution, but there was no denying the progress there. Where only decades before there had been little more than the mud hole of the prairie, a frontier town on the edge of an unimaginable wilderness, there now stood a huge, elegant city with elevated trains zipping citizens and tourists from the downtown area to the exposition's sparkling fairgrounds. Only in America could a city barely more than 20 years old have been the home of the convention that nominated Abraham Lincoln for president. Though graft and corruption surely played their role in Congress's decision to choose Chicago as the site of the world's Columbian Exposition, there was also no denying that the city was a quintessential example of the can-do American spirit. It is difficult today to impress upon people just how big the Columbian Exposition was. It covered more than twice the space of the Exposition Universelle. More than 200 gleaming white buildings were specially constructed, several of which were then among the largest buildings in the world. There were some 27 million paid admissions to the fair between May and October of 1893, roughly the equivalent of half the population of the United States at the time. To imagine the impact of the fair on the people who passed through the gates, consider how many of the attendees came from small farming communities. Many of them had never seen a building larger than a 2-story barn, Many have never been higher off the ground than the time they climbed up a haystack. Of course, such attendees would never have seen a light bulb before, and now they were confronted with a vast city within a city of gleaming white buildings, every one of which was covered in brilliant electric lights. Amazingly, these lights made the fairgrounds seem just as bright at night as they were during the day. So before we move on, there's a few photos here. One says Exposition Grounds, Columbian Exposition, Chicago. And the photo is courtesy of the Library of Congress. And the next photo we have is entering Midway Plaisance to the World's Fairgrounds, Chicago, and it's also photo courtesy of the Library of Congress. And we have one more while we're showing all of them here. Midway Plaisance, home of Edward Muybridge's Zoopraxographical Hall, the world's first movie theater. Photo courtesy of the Library of Congress. So this is very important here, pertaining to our topic of this deep dive series. Now, where the theater is in this photo, it beats me. I'm going to have to really look at this. But you can see in the background the original Ferris wheel. And I want everyone to know that the Ferris wheel that is seen here, that is mentioned to be at the Chicago Exposition, it is not the one that is at Navy Pier today. That Ferris wheel is practically brand new. And no, it is not a replica of what was at the World's Fair. I mean, I guess structurally it's a lot better. We'll have some photos of the Exposition Fair wheel at some point. But they were basically like, they were described as train cars on the thing. So they were a lot bigger. They held a lot more people. But that one, like, they dismantled everything. They dismantled everything except the Museum of Science and Industry, the one that's titled that building today. Because before, the Field Museum was at that building, and that building is one of possibly two that survived the World's Fair. And in the book Devil in the White City, they do go into detail about the architects using plaster Paris for, I mean, interior walls for sure, but exterior walls, I would have to go back and look at that again, because that wouldn't make too much sense, putting plaster outside. But these are things that are documented. They could have put something else on top of the plaster. We really don't know. We don't have all that much information on it. Okay, so we're going to continue reading here. And we're almost done. So we'll keep going. Electricity, indeed, would be the star attraction of the fair, pointing the way to a new century in which electricity would bring previously unimagined change and progress to every aspect of daily life. Long before the fair even opened, the New York Advisor stated that the electrical exhibits alone would make a trip to Chicago worthwhile. One of the major innovations of the fair was the building of a midway, a section of the fair for the amusements that would separate from the halls where the great thinkers of the day would hold forth, and where different countries would show off their achievements in technology, agriculture, manufacturing, and the fine arts. On the midway, you could ride the massive Ferris wheel, watch Little Egypt, the stage name of belly dancer Farida Mazar Spiropoulos, dance the Hoochie Coo tour of Bidon encampment, or attend a... Or sorry, I read that all together. Dance the Hoochie Coo tour of Bidon encampment, or attend what amounted to the first movie theater in history, though hardly anyone noticed this theater at the time. Situated in an inconvenient location at the end of the midway, Edward Muybridge was granted a concession for his zoopraxographical hall. By this time, Muybridge had developed a device he called the zoopraxiscope, a sort of primitive movie projector. Muybridge had printed a series of images onto the edges of glass discs that would rotate onto a canvas screen by a light. As the glass discs rotated inside of the zoopraxiscope, the images on the screen appeared to move. Muybridge's hall probably deserves to be called the first commercial movie theater in the world. Muybridge, however, utterly failed to realize the potential of what he had created. Though he was placed on the midway, where he would give lectures about the zoopraxiscope, his focus was strictly on the science of what he was doing. Given the choice between watching Little Egypt dance the Hoochie Coo and seeing Professor Muybridge present a lecture on animal locomotion, nearly everyone went with Little Egypt. If projection had developed to the point where he could have shown his images of naked women showing or jumping up and down on one foot as moving pictures, one suspects the lectures would have been better attended. As it was, the zoopraxographical hall was a total flop. The nearby Street in Cairo exhibit made more money than Muybridge's hall by a margin of more than 1,000 to 1. Yeah, Jason, isn't that interesting? He was projecting from glass rather than film. And think about how much. I would assume it would be a lot easier, but the storage of the glass slides to project a motion picture, especially at the length of that they are today. That'd be like a small warehouse of glass discs, or glass slides, I should say. It is interesting to think about, though. So, elsewhere at the fair was a slot machine known as the tachoscope, invented by Otto Anschutz of Germany. It was similar to the zoopraxiscope in that it created the illusion of a moving picture by displaying images on a spinning disc. See, now we're getting somewhere here. That's another note for me to take. But these guys all had a similar idea around the same time. There's a name for that phenomenon, too. And from what we understand already, what Edison took one of these guys' idea and tweaked it, and he's the one that got noticed for it. Alright, moving on. The images were faintly lit, and with Edison's kinetoscope concept visible to only one or two people at a time through a window in the machine, which was mounted on the wall. The tachoscopes were not much more advanced than Muybridge's zoopraxiscope, and even though they could not be shown to a whole crowd at once, they still outdrew Muybridge 15-1. One thing, however, was missing from the fair: the planned pavilion of 25 kinetoscopes. Wow. So not only did they just gloss over the whole fact that this was an individual movie theater, like only one person at a time could view. They didn't say that right away until now. But also that they were planning to have a pavilion of 25 of these individual kinetoscopes so that they could have an audience of 25 people. And then all of those, I think, would run on their own times. So you'd have to just have them all run individually. And then we ended up with what was more convenient. So I think we'll cover what I think is the discovery of like large screen projection. I can't think of the term right now. But we'll continue here. Throughout 1891, 1892, and 1893, Thomas Edison and W.K.L. Dixon had worked hard to perfect their machine, and a single, mostly working prototype was completed and used for a demonstration in Brooklyn in May 1893. Edison's methods of managing his lab, however, were taking their toll. Dixon had suffered a nervous breakdown earlier in the year, and he had taken a leave of absence to recuperate. Another employee was given a contract in late June to create 25 kinetoscopes for the fair based on the prototype. Unfortunately, it was rumored that this employee found it difficult to stay sober. Kinetoscopes would ultimately not be ready in time for a grand public unveiling at the fair. Wow. Sorry, I'm just reading certain portions here. So Dixon fell ill after having a nervous breakdown. Edison tried to help finish the job and get it moving, but the kinetoscope would not be time. There wouldn't be time for it to premiere, based on the deadlines. And what I was going to mention is the architects also were facing deadlines that they couldn't meet. So there was a lot of that going on at the time. Alright, let's continue. The Chicago writer Herma Clark wrote a column in the Daily Tribune from 1929 to 1959 titled When Chicago Was Young. It consisted of fictional letters written by one Martha Freeman Esmond to her childhood friend Julia Boyd, although many of these letters were merely thinly disguised accounts of real encounters Clark had observed while working as a secretary to a socially prominent Chicago family in the late 19th century. In a letter dated August 24th, 1893, Esmond wrote to Boyd, telling her of the time she had spent with her grandson in Chicago that summer. She, her husband, Will, and grandson Esmond had visited, though stalked may be a better term, Edison at his hotel, saying that young Esmond desired the privilege of gazing at him for a few minutes. Edison greeted them kindly and had a pleasant chat with the three of them. Will asked if he had any more wonders like the phonograph, and Edison replied that he was working on a kinograph, a method of producing moving photographs. Quote, I can't quite understand how it's done, end quote, Martha wrote. Nor what good it will be when perfect. It seems to me rather useless. But Will and Esmond had caught some of the inventor's enthusiasm and were full of excitement over it. Mr. Edison said it is very hard to get the grimaces of a man's face or working of a man's hands playing the piano, but the method has really been perfected. Wow, think about that one. I'm going to reread that. Mr. Edison said it is very hard to get the grimaces of a man's face or the working of a man's hands playing the piano, but the method has really been perfected. He was anxious to have an invention exhibited at the fair, but it was not ready for that. He was anxious to have the invention exhibited at the fair, but it was not ready for that. Indeed, the fair was for Edison something of a flop. Although electricity was the star of the show, it was not Edison who was providing it. He had bid fiercely for the contract, but was outbid in the end by Westinghouse and Tesla, whose alternating current was proving to be far superior to Edison's direct current system. A relentless quest to squash alternating current electricity, which his rivals supplied in competition with his own direct current, Edison had spent 20 years doing everything he could to encourage rumors that AC electricity was terribly dangerous. He made speeches and published lengthy pamphlets telling stories about people whom AC had killed, and he had even arranged to provide a demonstration of his theories. In one of the more despicable marketing stunts in history, Edison arranged for his rival's alternating current electricity to be used to execute a convicted murderer. Even 10 years after the fair, when vast improvements had been made at capturing and projecting moving images, Edison would notoriously make a film depicting an elephant being electrocuted by AC. So that's early 1900s there. At the World's Fair, Nikola Tesla, now dubbed the Wizard of Physics, demonstrated how safe his electricity actually was by using himself as a conductor. Sparks and bolts of lightning were shot right through his body. By this time, however, Edison had won the publicity war. Around the country, people thought of Edison when they saw an electric light of any sort. The Westinghouse's logo was the one prominently displayed in the electrical building. It was Edison who the public wished to credit, and he was only too happy to let them, even though he had personally seen to it that none of his light bulbs were used with Tesla's system. When the World's Fair was also emerged as a place where the public first saw and paid for the moving images, they linked Edison's name to that too. There are many references in works of historical nonfiction to the kinetoscopes actually being present at the fair, including Eric Larson's Devil in the White City, which describes the notorious serial killer H.H. Holmes admiring movies on Edison's machines. These references, however, are most likely based only on the advanced publicity that insisted that the kinetoscopes would be there. I think that is so vital. I'll reread that one more time. By this time, however, Edison had won the publicity war. Around the country, people thought of Edison when they saw an electric light of any sort. The Westinghouse's logo was the one prominently displayed in the electrical building. It was Edison who the public wished to credit, and he was only too happy to let them, even though he had personally seen to it that none of his light bulbs were used with Tesla's system. When the World's Fair also emerged as the place where the public first saw and paid for moving images, they linked Edison's name to that too. There are many references in works of historical nonfiction to the kinetoscopes actually being present at the fair, including Eric Larson's The Devil in the White City, which describes the notorious serial killer H.H. Holmes admiring movies on Edison's machines. These references, however, are most likely based only on the evidence. I'm sorry, going over and over. These references, however, are most likely based only on the advanced publicity that insisted that the kinetoscopes would be there. Edison would be careful to ensure that people continued to link his name to motion pictures for the next 25 years as well. Most everyone involved in the Columbian Exposition, including Edison, in his grand quest to present himself as a role model, would have said that the true purpose of the World's Fair was not to show off innovations, but to inspire the fairgoers to create, to invent, and to dream. Sure enough, over the course of the fair, one by one, many of the men who would create the American motion picture industry filed through the gates and were inspired, indeed profoundly changed by what they saw. And we got a few names here. George Spoor, S-P-O-O-R, who would co-found the S&A Film Manufacturing Company, perhaps the most enduring of the Chicago studios, would later claim he had first seen moving pictures on the tachoscope machine at the World's Fair. He would go on to team up with the suburban Chicagoan Edward Amet, A-M-E-T, to become a pioneer in the film exhibition business in the 1890s before starting his famous Chicago studio with Gilbert M. Anderson in 1907. The original automobile, the steam-powered horseless carriage, was introduced at the fair and would eventually be purchased by Colonel William Selig with the money he made from the Selig Polyscope Company, whose studio was on the northwest side of Chicago. The colonel would use the carriage as a prop for chimpanzees in his popular animal pictures. He would also use the replicas of Christopher Columbus's ships that had been built for the fair in the 1912 movie The Coming of Columbus, which was among the first feature-length motion pictures. The film would earn him a medal from Pope Pius X, despite the fact that Selig was not even a Catholic. But after building a small empire in Chicago, the colonel would also eventually open the first movie studio in Southern California. L. Frank Baum, a writer, oil salesman, and photographer, was dazzled by the White City built on the fairgrounds, and it would reportedly inspire him to create the gleaming Emerald City in the book that made him famous, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, originally published in Chicago in 1900. 15 years after the fair, Baum would also use the Selig Polyscope studio in Chicago to film the first of the Wizard of Oz movies. Chicagoan Burton Holmes, no relation to H.H. Holmes, an explorer and photographer who gave wildly popular illustrated lectures on his world travels and is credited with coining the term travelogue, visited the Midway and was inspired to begin incorporating motion pictures into his appearances. He eventually became an important documentary filmmaker himself. In an illustrated lecture at Chicago's Central Music Hall in 1897, Holmes told of a recent trip to a primitive and remote area in the mountains of Algeria. Holmes said he had been startled there one day when he found himself addressed in good Chicago slang. "Ah, there," a voice called off to him. "Seems to me I saw you on the Midway." Incredibly, the voice belonged to a fakir who had driven a thriving business in the shadow of the Ferris wheel. Wow. Across the street from the fairgrounds, Buffalo Bill Cody had rented an adjacent park to stage his famous Wild West show. Buffalo Bill was hardly an old frontiersman himself, though he claimed to have been injured countless times fighting Indians. His wife insisted he was making up nearly all these stories. But many performers in his show were authentic. The show represented a borderline between the days when the Old West was still real and the days when it would exist only in myths put forth by the genre of film that would dominate the industry for much of the 20th century. Thomas Edison and his crew may have had the popularity of the Wild West show in mind a decade later when they made The Great Train Robbery, the first significant Western movie. Meanwhile, back at the lab, Edison's team was beginning to film subjects for their eventual commercial launch of the kinetoscope. The popularity of strongman Egan Sandow at the World's Fair made the bodybuilder an obvious choice for a motion picture subject, and a film was made of him flexing his muscles. He would soon be a prototypical movie star, helping to propel the popularity of the kinetoscope across the sea, where photographer and Claude Antoine Lumiere, so one of the Lumiere brothers, would see it in Paris and challenge his sons Auguste and Louis to make a better machine. So the father of the Lumiere brothers. All of these innovations would come together, be broken apart, and come together and break apart again. For a brief period when movies were in their infancy, on the borderline between novelties and works of art, Chicago would be the film capital of the world. Building up the industry in a place like Chicago rather than the East Coast was something of a necessity. The early American film pioneers had to stay far away enough from New York and New Jersey to stay under Thomas Edison's radar. And that's a fact we will dive into another day. But that is the end of Chapter 2. Now, Chapter 3 is titled The Dawn of Exhibition. So we'll still be talking about the World's Fair. And next week, that's exactly what we'll do. So thank you again, everyone, for being here today as I read through Flickering Empire. Again, you could find this on Amazon. This hardcover here is going right now for $80. You can get the paperback for $25. But I am not a sponsor of this book. I'm just reading it because I love film. And this is my channel, and this is what I decide to talk about, this series. That's all there is to it. There's no conniving around here. But that'll do it for today. I really appreciate all of you being here. Man, this is a short one, 38 minutes. But I want to keep it to just one chapter per show. So next Saturday, we'll do part 3. I do want to start incorporating these other books. This chapter we read today mentioned about the Devil in the White City novelization. It already said that there's some errors in that book that do not line up with factual history. So there's already problems here. Stuff that I was exposed to in the education system have flaws in them. And Eric Larson is a pretty well-known novelist, but that's one thing I don't like about these novelizations of history is that they take those creative liberties and then you're left stuck with trying to figure out what's fact and fiction. And when they try to conflate the two, that's where we get all of this division and all these different topics. Like, if you start making so many fictional movies or just fictional stories based on historical events, that's why we're so uninformed here today, in the current day. Thank you, Jason. I appreciate that. And I see we got a few other people here too. Good to see you here. But yeah, this is going to be it for today. And I appreciate that you're enjoying the series along with me. But yeah, I will continue to be sharing these little things. I think since some of these chapters will be shorter like this, that's where I'll be able to hop into a second book, like on the same subject material, and then we could jump back and forth. I got some really good photo books that I'd like to show of old Chicago architecture. So if I find a few things that are from this time period that we're reading through right now in Flickering Empire, we'll pull that out. We'll go and I'll show you a few of those pages. But that's how I envision the next few episodes or parts of this deep dive to go. So, again, thank you all for being here. Really appreciate it. This is a really short one, but I will try to keep these to 1 hour. So this is probably going to be the shortest of them to date, but no worries. It is going to happen. I want it so that it's digestible for you. If you can't sit down and binge all of them in a day, like at least you could sit down and watch one that's a little under an hour, or have it on in the background as audio. So that's about it, guys. Hope you have a good rest of your weekend, and until the next one, class dismissed.